Please rewind this cassette.
Hey, Pat here. So this is going to be a little introduction to my next series of video essays, which are going to be covering the films and the filmmakers of the 1970s. To get into the 70s, we have to get in almost 30 years of cinema prior to that, and how the 70s was the result of many years of influences and an overall change of form. In the 40s, we got Italian neorealism, and this included films like The Bicycle Thieves or Rome Open City from great filmmakers like Rossellini. With neorealism, there was an attempt to capture a certain grit that Hollywood wasn't providing at the time. More handheld camera work and almost documentary-like approach. Naturalism in the acting and in the way that you present the stories. Slice of life, if you will. This led us to the French New Wave of the 50s and the 60s. This included filmmakers like Francois Truffaut and Godard. A lot of these films have a loose narrative structure. Everything was shot on location and the filmmakers used portable equipment. This was a benefit as it required less time to do setups. Most of the New Wave films included long takes and strong sense of subjective camera work. There's no clear answers in New Wave cinema, and many believe it created a more complex characterization that felt true to human nature. Now, to go back a bit again, one of the great things about Hollywood films of the 1940s and 50s are the people behind the typewriter. There was an explosion of great novelists and playwrights writing some of the tightest screenplays ever. The dialogue filled with the sharpest of wit. An example of this would be something like Sweet Smell of Success. Now let's fast forward to the 60s, a decade many consider to be one of the weakest in all of cinema. Of course, there was stuff like Psycho, Hard Day's Night, or the Connery Bond films, The Graduate. But most of the 1960s feels like bad leftovers of the 50s. There was a lack of moral ambiguity and filmmakers with a unique artistic vision. Luckily, for all of us, young filmmakers with the influence of the New Wave began to challenge the tedium of 60s Hollywood. This gave us great films like The Graduate, Midnight Cowboy, Easy Rider. New Hollywood was here, and not only did it include directors and writers on par with the greats of the Golden Age, but it also tapped into the zeitgeist of the decade. Bonnie and Clyde is one of the better examples of this, as it was an early sign of the increased violence we would see in 70s cinema. Filmmakers like Spielberg, Scorsese, Altman, Coppola, De Palma, Allen, and many others helped continue to popularize the new Hollywood movement. Filmmakers cared about morally gray characters and narratives that didn't need to have a classic structure. American acting was also evolving, and we got guys like De Niro, Pacino, Nicholson. The method acting made popular by Marlon Brando was becoming the norm. And we started to see a commitment to the craft that didn't exist in American cinema prior to this. Hollywood took notice of what was happening, and of course, they had to capitalize on the phenomenon. Producers like Robert Evans helped give us modern classics like The Godfather, and arguably the greatest noir of all time, Chinatown. At the same time, we were getting the birth of the modern blockbuster with films like American Graffiti, The Exorcist, Jaws, and eventually, Star Wars. To make this a little bit more than just a basic history lesson, I'm going to connect this as to why I find the 70s to be the best decade in film history, or at least my favorite. There's never been a time where filmmakers had this much freedom. You don't feel the studio in these movies. You don't feel the need to please mainstream audiences or stick to some kind of rule book. What's amazing is the pure artistic expression of this decade, with one classic after another. Even the B movies of the 70s were good, and there's honestly too many great films to count on a single list. There's movies from the 70s that the greatest film buffs can still discover or search for. You have century-defining comedies like Animal House, Life of Brian, Blazing Saddles. You have the birth of the midnight movie and cult films like Rocky Horror Picture Show or Pink Flamingos. The writing is as sharp as that of the classics of Hollywood, and yet the need to challenge the conventions is as strong as anything from neorealism or the New Wave. The 70s is the result of decades of technique and poetry that was driven by filmmakers with unique voices and cynical hearts. They were reflecting a world that felt indifferent to them, trying to find meaning behind the camera and using it to show you how they saw life. The New York filmmaker was breathing fire like a dragon. Masterpiece upon masterpiece was born from the fathers of everything we strive for in the arts today. There would be no HBO without the 70s character study. These guys were well-read and had hundreds of movies to pull from. Nobody really ever had that before them. You can feel the influence in these films. But the amazing thing about the 70s is that underlying creation of the new. There's never gonna be another Apocalypse Now. There's no decade with as many great films as the 70s, but more importantly, there's no decade with as many gems. If it's a documentary like Gimme Shelter, a horror movie like Suspiria, a cop movie like The French Connection, a period piece like Barry Lyndon that's only gotten better with time, a tone poem like Badlands, an animated epic like Fantastic Planet, or a brilliant little piece of science fiction like Alien. What's made clear is the 70s has a bit of everything, and it had yet to be topped in its ambition and in its sheer artistry. If movies are a cigarette, the 70s was a cigar. So I'm going to be talking about some of my favorite films from this decade and some of my favorite filmmakers in a series of videos, and I hope you guys enjoy them. This is 70s Rewind.